Hello, Internet friend. Today on Value Side Conversations, when Benjamin Netanyahu visits the White House, can war be far behind? Well, it's Friday, and tomorrow begins the long wait to another potential war, this time against Iran again. The USS Abraham Lincoln and support vessels are battle-ready somewhere in the Arabian Gulf. Its crew anxiously awaits its orders to attack. The world holds its collective breath as everyone's attention now focuses on U.S. President Donald Trump, fresh from Wednesday's meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. Recent negotiations between Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi and U.S. envoys Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff have, as yet, not yielded any significant breakthrough. The Trump administration is looking for a reduction in both Iran's nuclear and missile capabilities. Joining us today to discuss this and other events of the week is Kyle Anzalone. We're fortunate that Kyle was able to make time out from a very busy schedule. Kyle is one of the most tireless advocates for international conflict resolution. He is the opinion editor for antiwar.com, news editor for the Libertarian Institute, and co-host of the Conflict of Interest podcasts. Kyle, it looks like we're headed for another Israel-Iran war. What's different this time? Both sides have had 7 months to prepare for round 2, but who do you think has made the better use of their time? Israel with its U.S. military aid, or Iran with both Russia and China providing military and logistic assistance?
Boy, that is a good question. I'm not sure who made better use of the time, but it's much easier to produce offensive missiles than it is to produce interceptors.
Yes.
They require a lot of semiconductors and different technology to be able to, because you're talking about, you're firing a missile at a ground target, something that almost every country could do, very easy to do. And also from the Iranian perspective, I'm sure a lot of times if that missile hits somewhere within like a half-mile radius of where they fire it, it effectively carries the same deterrent effect. I'm sure they would like to be able to hit things on a dime, but they don't necessarily have to cause damage and destruction, especially in a very densely populated country like Israel is. On the other hand, Israel has to be able to shoot down the incoming Iranian missile, and that's very difficult to do. So I think in a sense, the Iranians probably made better use of the time and are now better prepared for a conventional war with Israel than Israel is for an air defense war with Iran. Now, there are other factors in this I would have to mention, though, which is how much American firepower is in the region.
Yes.
And Israel seems to have the American military at its beck and call. And in the summer, I believe the U.S. had 2 aircraft carrier strike groups in the Middle East. They had 2 THAAD interceptors and a Patriot interceptor, and then, of course, additional warplanes. Now, right now, the U.S. just has 1 aircraft carrier strike group in the Middle East, although there are additional destroyers there. I think there's only 3 to 5 destroyers that are part of the Abraham Lincoln aircraft carrier strike group, but then there's an additional 3 destroyers. I'm not sure where they were moved from, and I think there is at least 1 or 2 that's with the 5th Fleet anyways, and that's stationed out of Bahrain. But there's a couple destroyers already in the Mediterranean. But just, I believe it was Wednesday, the Wall Street Journal reported that Donald Trump ordered the George H.W. Bush aircraft carrier to get ready. So I think in a sense that I actually breathe a sigh of relief in the fact that I was going to get this weekend have some time to rest and relax, and I wouldn't be covering U.S. strikes on Iran, because it's going to take maybe a week to get the ships ready and then another week or 2 before they're in position. Now, that depends where they're going. They may be going to the Eastern Mediterranean to essentially sit off the coast of Israel and act as Israel's defense in the conflict, versus going into the Arabian Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, where they would, I think, be more for either defending U.S. troops in the Middle East. We have major air bases in Qatar, the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, bases in Iraq, fewer bases in Syria, but we still have some troops stationed in Syria. And so certainly we'll need to defend all those soldiers from incoming Iranian attacks. So anyways, I think in a couple weeks, the U.S. military footprint in the Middle East is actually going to be greater than it was in June. And that's something to weigh into the whole calculation as well, because rather than just sending the 2 THAAD interceptors and Patriot interceptor to Israel, we've now deployed at least a half dozen THAAD and Patriot interceptors across the Middle East. The Pentagon hasn't been particularly open about that, but they've named, I think, a total of 7 countries that those systems were being deployed to. So certainly a lot of radar, and a big part of that too isn't just the missiles, but the radars that come with them, and helping Israel's Iron Dome and Arrow systems to be able to intercept, identify the incoming Iranian missiles earlier, and give them a greater chance of intercepting the munitions.
Yes, exactly. Here's a thesis I'd like you to kind of consider. It's had me puzzled for a while. Scott Ritter reports that Netanyahu has told Trump that Israel can absorb 700 ballistic missiles only. So any war must be quick and decisive. He thinks of 5 days or less. He now concludes that Israel does not want this war. But the other premise is, and the one I think we need to consider, is that Israel is calling for overwhelming American force. Which do you think it is?
I do think that Netanyahu wants war. A big part of that comes from how this really all played out, where, we did have the 12-day war in June, but from the perspective of Donald Trump in Washington, the narrative after that 12-day conflict was, this is over and done with. We've taken out Iran's nuclear program. We don't have to worry about them making nuclear weapons, right? Trump likes to be one and done on these major geopolitical issues. He tried to do it with the Houthis in Yemen, this massive bombing campaign, didn't work. The kidnapping of Maduro, at least from his perspective, now did work. And so I think Donald Trump, Operation Midnight Hammer was just one round of strikes against Iran. So Trump likes to be one and done and declare victory. And going back to war with Iran 8 months later really proves everybody in the non-interventionist, realist camp right that bombing Iran in June wasn't a one-off attack. It was a part of a bigger conflict in the Middle East. So at the end of December, Netanyahu requests a meeting with Trump, goes to Mar-a-Lago, and the reports are that Netanyahu basically said that Israel is in a position with Iran where we are either going to fight a number of small conflicts with Iran over the coming years, or we're going to do one big conflict and enact regime change in that country with a massive strike, and essentially ask Trump to attack Iran. So that's why I do, because I'm sure Netanyahu had that calculation before that Israel could absorb 700 Iranian ballistic missiles. Now, I do wonder how just because that was reported as coming out of Tel Aviv, it doesn't mean that that's now Netanyahu's thinking. The military could have given him a different assessment. That could have been Israelis' assessment minus the American military support and just how effective that is. So I guess a couple things on this point. One, Netanyahu is an absolute monster, and he has his eyes on expanding Israel's border, but more importantly, making sure there's nobody in the region who could stand up to him doing so. And that requires regime change in Tehran. And probably, I think the best outcome for the Israelis in Iran would be a Syria or Libya style situation where you effectively have the fracturing of the state and just a prolonged civil war. Because, if a country's in prolonged civil war, it really can't do anything, certainly offensive against Israel, but even stop Israel from attacking, right? People forget, Israel bombed Syria 2 or 3 times a week for a decade. Right? And it was never counted as a war, but Israel was at war with Syria throughout the entirety of the Syrian civil war, which really wasn't a civil war because of the American, the Turkish, the Saudi, the Qatari influence, but, they exploited what was interfighting in Syria, fracturing of Syria to be able to ruthlessly attack that country. So I do think that would be Netanyahu's preference in all of this. The problem that when a lot of people talk about a potential conflict with Iran is they talk about it from the conventional war standpoint, which is what we saw unfold in June. The problem that the Iranians have is they're essentially like, you're at a bar, some guy pits a fight with you, right? He starts swinging at you, and so you swing back, but he's got a gun. Right. So you can only, even though he started the fight, even though you are only defending yourself, you could only take it so far, right? You could only hit him so many times before he pulls out the gun and shoots you. And that's Israel and America's nuclear weapons stockpile. And so I hear a lot of talk from the Iranians that this time is going to be different, that this time we're really going to strike back and hit Israel hard. This time is not going to just be a symbolic response against Americans, but Iran has to consider that Netanyahu is absolutely insane. And Donald Trump, I don't think, is cognitively all there, but certainly his top priority is avoiding a prolonged conflict with Tehran. And so if Tel Aviv is getting battered, if an American aircraft carrier or destroyer is hit and goes down, and we lose hundreds, if not thousands, of American sailors, I don't see how either of those leaders don't just make the option to drop a nuclear weapon in Iran and end the conflict. So I don't know I'm really terrified about what's going to happen here, because it seems just like a completely untenable situation. The only good outcome would be Donald Trump waking up tomorrow morning and his, cognitive decline has progressed past the angry at everything stage to just kind of the deliriously happy, like Joe Biden often seemed to be when he had an ice cream cone, and just decides, because look, there isn't actually an American interest here. There is no American interest actually in all reality in Iran. The Iranians don't want to build a nuclear weapon. Even after the Americans assassinated their top general, one of the most popular figures in Iran, after the Americans overthrew the Syrian government that was backed by Iran, after the Israelis invaded and occupied southern Lebanon, at no point has Iran reversed course and decided to build a nuclear weapon, which means they have no interest in doing them. Additionally, they don't even have a delivery system for a nuclear weapon to the United States of America anyways. And so Iran presents no threat to the United States. So if Donald Trump wanted to walk away tomorrow, it would make no meaningful difference in the national security interests of the average American citizen whatsoever at all. But even from the context that they're talking about here, Iran is willing to agree to limitations on their nuclear program. So Donald Trump could essentially go back to 2015, resign the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, or Iran nuclear deal, and declare victory and claim that he's a peacemaker, right? Like, he could do this tomorrow. And the Israelis, they could complain and they could throw a fit, but at the end of the day, unless Israel is willing to just like start unprovoked war and then nuke Iran, they really don't have an option here. And also, I think maybe the U.S. could even shut that down if they tried. Israel's completely relying on American aid. And so Donald Trump could just end all of this tomorrow and exit the Middle East peacefully if he wants to. I think that scenario is very unlikely. That essentially what has happened here is Donald Trump has allowed Benjamin Netanyahu to dictate the terms on which the U.S. is talking to Iran. And this is maybe the most clear example of how this whole policy is meant to benefit Israel. The Israelis and the Americans are demanding that Iran limit their ballistic missile range to 300 kilometers. Well, that in no way presents any benefit to the United States of America, because 300 kilometers from Iran, you are actually within range of the Fifth Fleet, the Al Udeid Air Base, and many of the American bases in Iran still. So probably the majority of U.S. forces in the Middle East are still going to be within range of the Iranian missiles, under the deal that the U.S. is proposing. The only party that this helps is Israel, because Israel's a few thousand kilometers away from Iran. And so it would mean that Israel could hit Iran at any time and Iran couldn't strike back at all. And that's the situation that Israel wants. But the terms in no way benefit the United States of America. But those are the terms the Trump administration is putting out. And because of that, the Iranians can't accept that. They cannot accept a deal where they don't at least have some deterrent capability to prevent the Israelis from attacking. And so now you're in a position where the Iranians are going to say no. And Donald Trump has now said probably 36 times that if the Iranians say no, he's going to order an attack.
Yes, exactly. Interesting note. There's an unconfirmed report out this morning that the USS George H.W. Bush is already headed to the Eastern Mediterranean and will arrive by about Wednesday of next week.
Wow.
So this could be speeding up, unfortunately, much faster than we think. Now, I 100% agree that Donald Trump wants a one and done, quick and easy victory, kind of a Maduro situation where they go in quickly and exit quickly. But is that even conceivable? I mean, Iran is going to have a lot to say about this, with a lot of reserves and a lot of missiles underground and so on. I think Iran could easily dictate how long this lasts. What do you think?
Well, I do think for the most part, Iran, at least they get to dictate how long it remains a conventional war, right? Like the nuclear factor is always there. And so,
Right,
and again, we're talking about Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump. These are not two people that have much regard for human life or
right.
international norms or anything like that. So who knows how quickly the US or Israel would decide to use a nuclear weapon. But I do think that Iran probably gets to dictate, if the war starts, how long it goes on, how much damage they want to do in Israel. It seems from all the reporting, the reason that the 12-day war was a 12-day war was because the Israelis cried uncle,
Right.
because they said, we can't keep doing this. Now,
Yes.
I think the reason the Iranians didn't say, well, we're going to continue to attack you for another week or something like that, we're going to, use a larger percentage of our missile stockpile, which we can more quickly replenish, is because they understood that if they kept hitting Israel after Israel asked for a truce, Netanyahu could resort to the nuclear option. So, I think it's complex to figure out. I would say from a lot of what I'm hearing from the Iranian government, they are saying that this time it's going to be different. And look, this is like somebody who's effectively been bullied, right, by the United States and Israel, where we've attacked Israel attacked them in an unprovoked war. The U.S. joined it, even though Iran wasn't attacking U.S. bases in the Middle East or anything like that. We have from across the political spectrum, the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent to Nancy Pelosi, all celebrating how we destroyed the Iranian economy. But
Right.
if you're an Iranian, that means, if your uncle has cancer, the medicines might not be there. Or, if you need water or something like that, water might not be there. Food prices are insane. And so your poor quality of living, American politicians are celebrating installing that. And at some point, this just becomes intolerable for a country. And even if they are afraid that Israel or the U.S. would resort to nuclear weapons, you have to, at some point, I think, deal enough of a blow to one of those two countries to say, like, hey, we
Yeah.
can fight back. We're done just standing here and allowing ourselves to be beat up on. I almost think it would be better for the Iranians to just build a nuclear weapon than to actually go forward with like a massive salvo attack on Israel or something like that. Because once Iran has nuclear weapons, then the whole dynamics change, right? Dropping a nuclear weapon on Iran, even on Tehran, would absolutely be devastating and horrible to think about. But that's probably not going to cause the collapse of the Persian society, right? That's
Right.
existed for millennia. On the other hand, Israel's only existed since 1948. And so even if you land a nuclear weapon somewhere around Tel Aviv, that's probably the end of the state of Israel. And
Plus, it's so
so,
small.
right. And
It's tiny.
And look, like if there's a possibility that you're going to get nuked, a lot of people in Israel, they weren't born there, right? They still have citizenship in all kinds of Western countries that are going to be much safer, much
Right.
more prosperous, not not subject to nuclear fallout in that case. So I don't know. I guess if I were like, I try to do this where, I put myself in the position of a Russian general, a Chinese general, a North Korean general, an Iranian general, and think, what would I be telling Putin or Xi or the Ayatollah or Kim Jong-un? Because I think that's important to understand how they're thinking. And I think if I were an Iranian general, I would say, you have to let us make nuclear weapons. That way, we don't have to go to war with the United States and Israel,
Right.
because we could be like North Korea and say, look, we have a nuke. And I mean, Kim Jong-un makes this point all the time. Every time another leader that the U.S. doesn't like gets overthrown, like Assad or Maduro or Gaddafi or Saddam, he says, well, that's why I got this nuke right here, is to make sure that that doesn't happen to me next. And, it seems like nuclear weapons are really the only thing that keeps you safe from the American empire.
Wow. No, I 100% agree. Let's move over to Ukraine now. You recently wrote an article about the $185 million worth of subsequent aid that America is sending over to Ukraine. And that combines with, I think it is $1 billion that the EU or NATO is sending also. So the aid continues to flow majorly to Ukraine. Do you see any indication that the Trump administration is going to fulfill Donald Trump's campaign promises of moving towards peace in Ukraine?
No, and I never really thought he would. I always thought that the best indicator of Trump's second administration would be his first. And I've changed my thinking on that quite a bit. I think Trump is actually in a far different state of mind, particularly domestically. But one thing that does seem to still be the case is that Donald Trump just doesn't have either the attention span or the understanding of geopolitics needed to negotiate a very complex deal, right? Like he was able to make some progress in negotiations, meaningful progress in negotiations with the North Koreans. In Hanoi, in what was that, 2018 or 2019, there
Right.
was real expectation that they were going to sign an agreement to officially end the Korean War. In his second, he talked about getting along better with Putin, having this new nuclear arms control pact between the US, Russia, and China. None of that even got close to getting done. And so, the way Donald Trump, I think, thinks he could negotiate is how he negotiated when he was a New York businessman, a New York real estate developer, right? He was one of the top dogs. And so, when he was, not paying different contractors and things like that, he's got so much influence in New York City that he could kind of get away with that stuff or renegotiate the contract and pay a lot less. It doesn't work that way in geopolitics. Countries have real red lines that, this isn't him like screwing over another millionaire or billionaire. This is the Iranians believing that their country, that their society, that Persia is in jeopardy because of what the United States is doing. That's why we saw Vladimir Putin end up going to war in Ukraine. And again, during Trump's first administration, I don't think he really ever understood that these countries have real red lines, that this just isn't about money. It's about their history and their society. And a lot of these societies that we are talking about are, again, millennia old. They're, the United States is 250 years old. I think it's even hard to understand, like, how maybe the Ayatollah or Putin or Xi feels trying to lead these cultures that are thousands and thousands and thousands of years old and things. And so they're not going to just be ritually humiliated by Donald Trump at negotiations and make these major concessions. I think especially when they understand that the United States is an empire in decline. And while Donald Trump is going to likely be out of office, maybe up for re-election in 3 years, this isn't something that Xi or Putin or the Ayatollah have to worry about.
No, absolutely. Let's turn our focus to Gaza for a moment, which is obviously an extraordinarily difficult situation, but I think you might have some insight here. Um, we are somewhere close to phase 2 of a ceasefire that started early last year. On top of that, Donald Trump has come in with his Board of Peace, of which he's the chairman, and its primary target was supposed to be peace in Palestine, peace in Gaza. Um, I haven't heard of any progress along that line. I do hear of continued, I think up to 600 Palestinians have been killed by the IDF, but no peace in sight. Have you heard anything on that basis?
Yeah, so there's the Donald Trump administration, right? The Hamas is unhappy because Israel is attacking Gaza every single day, and as you said, killed about 600 Palestinians now since the truce went into effect 4 months ago. So that's like an average of 5 Palestinians a day. That's not actually Israel abiding by the ceasefire, and Israel doesn't want it to go forward either. And so the Donald Trump administration is just out there saying, "Oh, we're going into phase 2," when nothing has changed on the ground really since October 10th when the truce went into effect until now, other than Hamas releasing the Israeli hostages and helping to recover the bodies of the deceased. Um, so I think the Board of Peace is all a fiction. I haven't paid as much attention to it as some people just because I don't think it's going. I think Donald Trump would like it to last, but Netanyahu doesn't want it to, right? Like
Ah,
they want Gaza to be Israel. They don't want Gaza to be Trumpistan or Resort Trump or anything like that. They want to settle it with Israelis. I don't think they want this big international city. They just want it to be another part of Israel. I'm sure they'll build some hotels along the shoreline. I'm sure there'll be different like tech areas and businesses and things like that, but it's not going to be a city designed by Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. It's going to be a city designed by Israelis and for Israelis. And for that reason, Israel isn't going to let this go forward.
hmm.
So I think essentially what is happening right now is Israel is retooling and resting their soldiers. It had been a long time since they had gotten a break. As we mentioned before, Israel isn't a very big country. They have general conscription and things like that, except for the ultra Orthodox community. And so a lot of young men and women have been deployed for a long period of time. And the problem is when you have a country with a very small population, if they're all off occupying and fighting in Gaza, on the West Bank, and southern Lebanon, southern Syria, then who's working? Right?
Right,
Like this
right.
is this is a real thing that Israeli society had to deal with. Also, the fact that these are young men and women, and if you're a country like Israel where you're really trying to grow the Jewish population, well, if your men and women are all fighting war, then they're not at home making babies, and so that's also like so I think there's a sense here that they need to give their troops time to go home, to be a part of their families, to work in the economy. And then I've read reports in the Israeli media that they plan to go back to war in Gaza in March. And
Uh,
I think that will be kind of the final push, or not, maybe not final, but a push to drive a large number of Palestinians out of Gaza. There's a reason that so under the ceasefire deal, one of the things that Hamas really, really wanted was for Israel to allow new tents to enter Gaza, and I think about 60,000 mobile homes. And this would allow people to live in an actual house, not a house, but like a home, right? Like
right.
4 walls and a roof, a sink, an oven, and a bathroom. Like this would be absolutely huge for a large number of Palestinians and would allow like a basis for rebuilding in life to begin. But Israel hasn't allowed in any of that. They've allowed in a good amount of food. I think they've said like the famine warning is over. For the first time in almost a year, I think the WHO or UNICEF or one of these UN aid agencies reported that, their warehouses had enough food that they weren't just giving Palestinians like daily subsistence. They were giving them like multiple days of food at a time, which is great, right?
Good.
Like this isn't,
Yeah.
I'm not trying to say that there's a great situation in Gaza that people aren't suffering, just that there's some decent amount of food that are getting to the people right now. But they haven't allowed in enough medical supplies, and so that's killing a lot.
Mm.
They're not allowing medical equipment that's been destroyed to be replaced. So MRI machines, X-rays, all this really important stuff, incubators, ventilators, all those kinds of things aren't getting in. And Israel is making sure that more Palestinians leave Gaza every day than re-enter. And so what's happening now is a lot of medical patients, maybe kids with cancer or kids that had an amputation. When there's tens of thousands of kids in Gaza who have had amputations, many of them without anesthesia. But when a child gets an amputation, they're going to need, depending on the age, maybe a half dozen or a dozen surgeries as they grow in order to like address the stump and to make sure, I guess it gets very painful. I haven't looked at it because I'm sure it's horrific what would happen if you didn't have the additional surgeries. But that's all needed. And so there's like a few dozen Palestinians leaving every day. When it's children, there's a parent or two going with them. So maybe 100 or so Palestinians are leaving every day. And then Israel is only allowing like, I think a dozen or so about back in. So it seems that, the policy here is just to make sure there's a net negative population flow in and out of Gaza. And I think that's going to be accelerated in March, like I said.
Wow. Fascinating. Thank you, Kyle. And that's today's Value Side Conversation with our special guest, Kyle Anzalone. Don't forget, you can follow Kyle in one of his many roles as the opinion editor for antiwar.com, the news editor for Libertarian Institute, and the co-host of Conflict of Interest podcast. I'm David Ravel. Good day.